The story of the Ottawa Fire Department begins officially in 1848. Before that time, all firefighting seemed to have been a community effort, with bucket brigades battling blazes on a strictly voluntary basis. Old wooden buildings in BYTOWN made any outbreak of flames a very dangerous occurrence, and several bad fires brought home sharply to the city's residents the need for some equipment. It was early in the fall of 1848 that the first actual piece of firefighting apparatus, the horse-drawn engine Montreal, thundered through the streets in response to an alarm. Drawn by a single animal, the bright red Montreal was a stirring sight as it whirled into action along the old gravel and wood-block streets. However, there is no record of whether the Montreal won its first battle, or whether the fire blazed until it burned itself out, as most did in those days. Successful or not, the Montreal made such a hit that a second horse-drawn rig, the hand-pumped Alliance, and a manually propelled hook and ladder truck were brought to BYTOWN. Thus, by the end of 1848, the predecessor of the Ottawa Fire Department had exactly 3 pieces of equipment. Then the trouble began. The firemen petitioned Council for a building to house the equipment. Council replied that it could not see its way clear to such an expense. They recommended that at the earliest convenience and when funds permitted, a house be erected at George Street down by the Bywash. Council's short-sightedness had quick results. The equipment started to deteriorate almost at once. The following year, 1848, both the Montreal and the Alliance were reported to be in bad condition, and the hook and ladder truck in worse shape. In fact, at one fire, the Montreal was reported to have given up the ghost completely and stood broken down while flames consumed a large warehouse. Shortly afterwards, Council approved a sum of money to overhaul the engines. Quarters for the engines were found in a privately owned building, but a few months later, the owner of the building ordered the department to remove the engines, as he needed the quarters for other purposes. Again, the firemen petitioned Council for a fire station. Wiser this time, after the near loss of the equipment through exposure to weather the previous year, Council swung into action and with no delays and established a temporary, though waterproof, shed for the engines. By this time, with the Montreal, the Alliance, and the hook and ladder rig in almost constant action, local residents were beginning to learn that it was much cheaper to maintain a fire department than to let blazes follow the natural course of events and level buildings. So in March 1850, 3 fire wardens were appointed and set of bylaws drawn up to provide the capital with its first fire code. The following year, a 3-man fire committee was appointed. Then came the big break. A dangerous fire broke out in what was then the west end of the city. At the same time, a high wind sprang up. It was feared that the entire western section might go up in flames within a few hours. And it probably would have, except for the Montreal, the Alliance, the 2 rigs swung into action, and the amazement and joy of spectators battled the flames to a standstill in what may have been Ottawa's greatest display of firefighting courage and determination. The city was convinced, completely convinced. Things moved rapidly after that. 2 new engines, the Chaudière and the Rideau, were ordered from Montreal. A month later, a 3rd new rig, the Ottawa, arrived. Council authorized the building of not 1 but 3 fire halls at the corner of George Street and Musgrove, at the corner of Sally and Queen Street, and on Cumberland Street. A total of 60 men were members of various brigade companies manning the engines. Only the hook and ladder truck was left without a home, perhaps because it had not figured too prominently in the West End blaze. But with one type of trouble settled, another type flared. Jealousy raged between members of the various engine companies, each claiming their group was the best. In fact, the only brigade which really knew how to battle fire. The rivalry reached a pitch in 1855. Both the Alliance and the Ottawa companies, the city's two crack units, were housed in one building in Centertown. The reason for this, of course, was efficiency. It was considered wise to have the best and the most experienced brigades at the point of the most possible danger. But it didn't always work out that way. Rivalry was intense as the Alliance and Ottawa crews sped to the scene of the blaze. Each was anxious to get there first and lay down the first hose. Alas, the brigade finally degenerated to the level of placing obstacles in each other's path. Speed and efficiency were cut to a minimum, and there were actual reports of outlying brigades reaching a fire first while the nearby Alliance and Ottawa men blocked and hindered each other's paths en route. The situation was intolerable, so the Alliance engine, now rather ancient, was scrapped and replaced with one called the Queen. Then the new Queen Company was shunted to a new building on St. Paul Street, which is now Besserer. The homeless hook and ladder company, still seeking quarters, decided to take matters into their own hands. They bought a wooden shed at the corner of Cumberland and Murray Streets and moved their old rig into it. Another crew, named itself the Central, bought a second hook and ladder rig and moved it into the back of the old City Hall building, much to the disgust of the other crew. The rivalry between the different fire companies did not lessen, so late in 1855 the system was reorganized, and the rank and precedence of each unit clearly defined. To keep matters functioning as smoothly as possible, a single officer was chosen to head all brigades. He was John Langford, the first chief of the volunteer units, which grew into the present Ottawa Fire Department. Another milestone was passed in 1870 when the first steam fire engine made its appearance. The machine, privately owned, was purchased by the owners of the Chaudière Mill and was operated by mill workmen. Shortly afterwards, the city bought another steam machine named the Conqueror. The Ottawa Company raised money by public subscriptions and came up with its own engine, the John Heaney. Up until 1874, firemen were not paid for their services with the engine companies, and in fact only turned out when there was a fire alarm. In general, only skeleton crews were to be found in the stations if there was anyone there at all. In 1874, City Council decided Ottawa had grown large enough to support a fire department with paid full-time members, and salaries were given to the smoke eaters for the first time. A few years later, after considerable discussion and investigation, an electric fire alarm system was established for the sections of the city. The first electric alarm was turned in from the Customs House at the corner of Sparks and Elgin Streets. Records show that the fire was put out quickly. It wasn't until 1897, however, that the Ottawa Fire Department began to take on a whole new look. In that year, Chief Peter Provost came to Ottawa from Montreal to take over the department. He abandoned all the old hose reels, replacing them with proper hose wagons and an aerial truck. New fire halls were built and old ones were renovated. The fire department began running on an efficient basis. And it was just as well that such was the case, for in 1900 fire swept through most of the city of Hull and flames spread into Ottawa, starting spot fires that could have wiped out the capital as well as its smaller neighbor. 10 years after the Big Hull fire, Chief Graham decided to follow the lead of many cities in the United States and Canada and to switch to engines powered by gasoline motors. That move marked the beginning of the end of the colorful horse-drawn fire rigs.